Welcome, everyone. I'm Alexandra Zapata Joyel. I'm a Mexico-based future tense fellow, and we are so glad you've decided to escape the present moment and step forward and consider the future for the next hour with us. This event will be in English, but we are offering Spanish translation for those who would like to follow the conversation in Spanish. If you do want to take advantage of that feature, you can access real-time interpretation by clicking on the interpretation button on the bottom bar of the Zoom screen and choosing Spanish. So I'll quickly switch to Spanish for that. Bienvenidos a todos. Muchísimas gracias por estar con nosotros en este evento de Future Tense y el Convergence Lab. La conversación va a ser en inglés, pero tenemos interpretación simultánea y si prefieren escuchar la conversación en español. La barra de abajo en su pantalla de Zoom tiene esa opción de interpretación. Los invitamos a que hagan clic en el icono del mundo y seleccionen español para seguir la conversación con interpretación. Muchísimas gracias. Today's event is a collaboration between Future Tense and Arizona State University's Convergence Lab programming in Mexico. Future Tense is a project of ASU, the New America think tank, and Slate magazine, focused on exploring the impact of technology on society. In Mexico, Future Tense is fortunate to have Letras Libres magazine as a partner, publishing our content in Spanish. You can follow us on Twitter at Future Tense Now. I'm personally looking forward to this conversation. I'm honored to be invited to give this introduction. And for the first time in a while, and I don't want to get too political too soon, but I finally feel like at least in the US, we will have a leadership team that will allow us to think a little bit more about the future and address some of the challenges that we have, challenges from the past that we obviously cannot ignore. And this has been said a lot in the past few days, but recent news has made it easier to be a parent in terms of thinking about, at least for me, in terms of thinking about the kind of policy decisions and example that we will be setting for future generations. I'm very excited to hear from all of our panelists and what they have to say, not only about the last few days, but how they think democracies are shaping the future that all of us will be living in, that is every day more connected. Now before we get started and before I pass this conversation on to Ed and to the panelists that will be sharing their thoughts, I want to be able to share a poll question with all of you, and I want to get a sense of how you are seeing things. And the poll question is, do you believe our democracies have been getting better or worse over time at governing for our long-term interests? And the options are better, worse, or about the same. Just in terms of our Spanish audience, I will translate the answers and the question. ¿Sienten que las democracias han mejorado en su capacidad de gobernar para nuestros intereses de largo plazo? Y las opciones son, ¿han mejorado? ¿Han empeorado en su capacidad? ¿O siguen más o menos igual? So if you can answer the poll, and we would love to get your feedback on that and have that get the conversation started. So Ed, I think we all have a lot to talk about right now. I think there are obviously very definite challenges that our democracies are facing in terms of governing for our long-term interests. I would be interested in understanding if people are thinking about Mexico when they answer this question, or the US, or maybe both together. But this is definitely an interesting answer. And last thing before I hand this conversation off, We would love to hear from you. So I highly encourage you to ask questions as we go along. You can ask questions to all of our panelists, to one in particular. Please use a Q&A feature on the webinar on your screens. If you're listening to this conversation in Spanish, please feel free to pose your questions in Spanish and we'll translate them. Please don't be shy. And with that, I will hand it off to my Future Tense colleague, Ed Finn. Ed is the academic director of Future Tense and the architect of our fiction project. He is the founding director of the Center for Science and Imagination and the Imagination, and a professor at the University School for the Future of Innovation in Society. Ed, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Alexandra, for getting us started, for that great introduction and this thought-provoking poll. In case you can't see the numbers, only 10% of you, less than 10% of you think that democracies have gotten better at governing for the future. 2/3 of you think they've gotten worse, and 25% roughly think that we've stayed the same. So some food for thought as we get started. And what a great moment to be having this conversation as we are reflecting on the question of democracy and the transition of power in the United States. And we continue to reflect on the broader global context of the challenges we're facing in terms of climate change, in terms of good governance and democratic institutions, in terms of just getting along and fundamental forms of cooperation. So let me introduce our three panelists and note with Peter Schlosser, our first panelist, that unfortunately he is going to have to leave in about a little over 20 minutes because he has to get back to saving the future for us. So he'll just be here for the beginning of our chat. Peter Schlosser is one of the world's leading earth scientists and the vice president and vice provost of the Julianne Wrigley Global Futures Laboratory at Arizona State University. Kim Stanley Robinson is one of the world's leading science fiction writers, winner of the Hugo, Nebula, and Locus Awards, the author of more than 20 books, including the best-selling Mars trilogy, and most recently and most appropriately, his new novel, The Ministry for the Future, is just out with Orbit Books. And finally, Malka Older, we're delighted to have her as well, is a writer, an aid worker, and a sociologist. She is the author of the Sentinel Cycle, the trilogy of novels with Infomocracy, the first of those, again, very directly related to our conversation today. She's also the author of a story in our very own Future Tense fiction series on Slate. This spring, she will be teaching a course on science fiction in the School for the Future of Innovation and Society at ASU. So welcome all of you. Thank you for spending some time with us. And thank you all for joining us in the audience. Bienvenidos. So Peter, let me start with you with the big question. How do we govern for the long term? Particularly in terms of climate, but also our democratic institutions. I think all of these things, ultimately, when you think about the long term, they all become part of the same question, which is just good governance. How do you try to address that problem?
That's of course a loaded question, because in a way I think we don't know how we govern. We have tried several times, for example with the Kyoto Protocol, just sticking with climate now, where we try to have a consensus among everybody around the globe, in a way, all the countries, and clearly that didn't work. So in 2015 we embarked on a different experiment, the Paris Accord, or the Paris Agreement, which is actually based on a little bit less prescriptive, more almost voluntary commitments to action that would prevent the planet from overheating. And we are still in the middle of figuring out if that works or not, because about just 2 or 3 days ago, the US formally left the Paris Accord. With the change in leadership, we all assume that the US will enter it again. But then again, the Paris Accord might show us that the political leadership might not be the determining factor. It could well be that the private sector and society as a whole might have a bigger role to play than the political decision makers. So it is an open question. There are experiments going on, but it seems like a more open, a more voluntary approach, an appeal to the urgency might be the way to go.
Stan, this is something that you have taken on directly in the Ministry for the Future, and it's something you've explored in a number of your other novels as well, imagining alternatives to the current structures of governance. But what I find really compelling, I'm halfway through the new novel, is your attempt to really explicitly draw a line from where we are today towards a better future. Could you talk a little bit about how you approach the question, and maybe how you thought about it in the novel, or just what you think we should do?
Sure, thanks, Ed. Well, I agree with Peter. At this point, the crux issue is the Paris Agreement, and is it going to become like a League of Nations, a good idea that ultimately failed under the pressures of the nation state systems disagreeing with each other and competing? Or is it going to eventually become a framework for international agreement and that everybody can use to coordinate their efforts? Because we're in a nation state system, but we're on one planet. And so, as Peter suggested, that the national governments might be seeing things from the national point of view. That's their job. But since it's a global problem, it could be that the force of public opinion and the efforts of a kind of bottom-up effort will force the top diplomatic agreement people to get together and do the right thing for everybody. I often compare it to the Antarctic Treaty, which is a very idealistic and great treaty for protecting Antarctica, but whenever there's advantage to be had, it gets broken and then there's no sheriff. So I think the question of the general intellect or the public at large being the sheriff in this case from below might be how it goes forward.
Malka, what do you think? Again, Infomocracy offers another really bold vision for how you could try to change global governance, right? Another utopia narrative in a way. Is that something we should be working towards? And maybe you talk a little bit about that, or you also draw on your experience working in humanitarian aid and your many different hats that you wear. How do we govern for the long term? Oh, you're muted.
First we unmute. I think that, whether we head towards specifically the kind of world that I described in Infomocracy or not, it is imperative that we start to make changes in the ways that our systems and democracies work, because as been pointed out, the nation state system is far from ideal for dealing with global problems. And more, all the problems that we're facing are global to one extent or another, because we are so interconnected, because it is such a short distance for both ideas, people, and capital to travel. So we really need to start looking at how we can govern ourselves differently, how we can figure out a way to have a sheriff or an arbiter or some kind of supranational body that will help us function cooperatively in these cases. From the other side, I would say, as a sociologist, what I study is how governments react to disasters and how they improvise in the face of disasters. And we're pretty bad at that. But even so, we have actually more experience, I think, as governments in reacting, whether it's to disasters or occasionally to opportunities, than we do in really planning steadily ahead. And that's also something that I think we need to grapple with from the democracy standpoint. Because particularly in the US with a two-party system, but pretty much everywhere, we change governments frequently. And while this is very much a strength in some ways, it can also be quite a liability when we're talking about having consistent plans for the future. And to do that better, at a minimum, we need a kind of national consensus about which direction we want to head, even if it's in very broad terms, which seems like really a reach right now. But also I think to figure out some ways to have some overarching values that are built in beyond what's going to change every 4 or 8 years.
Yeah, this is something interesting, that a thread that ties all of your responses together is this problem of the base and the superstructure, that in some ways we want to build these superstructures that will be national or global organizations that will guide us in this long-term thinking. But it turns out we're not very good at building those, and they fall apart as soon as there's a short-term gain to be had. But it's also difficult to build from the bottom up and to build this sort of change this broader relationship we have with the future. And I want to ask about that a little bit. How do we create a different relationship with the future? Stan, this is something in your novel you talk about in various ways. One of them being changing our baseline appreciation of the discount rate. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Although I want to hear from Peter on this particular issue, especially since he's leaving us soon. So I'm going to just give a quick preface to my thoughts on this, because I could easily get lost in the weeds. And really, we're in an international economic system. So that is maybe the avenue we have to travel to make an effective fight against climate change, so that the nature of money, but also the discount rate, the way that we value the future and put a quantitative percentage devaluation of the future, makes our current cost benefit analyses skewed away from long-term survivability. And so that needs to be looked at. And then also, because capital will only go to the highest rate of return, a kind of very powerful gravity, path of least resistance to the rate of highest return, and saving the planet is not the highest rate of return, we're not going to save the planet. So this requires us to look at money itself, and maybe I can talk later about carbon quantitative easing as a way to address this systemic problem that we don't value the planet or the future people enough in our current economic system to do justice to them, or to get through or to dodge the mass extinction event.
Yeah, Peter, what are the goals of the Global Futures Laboratory in this context?
Well, we want to look holistically at, what do we see as emerging futures, and which ones are more desirable than others, and can we find pathways towards them? I think a lot of the decision making is driven by value systems, and there might be actually some hope if we are looking at the youth, because I think the youth movement shows, for example, Fridays for Future, but also some others that are coming up now, that the young people realize that what we are doing is we are narrowing their option space for the future. We are, what we want to have actually is a future of opportunity, not a future of sacrifice. And I think the younger generation feels more and more that they will be burdened with the consequences of the action that we have imposed on the planet since a long time and still do. So in my view, it is an interesting experiment to see how these youth movements might actually start to turn around the thinking a bit about the future, away from the more immediate pressures, opportunities, value systems, power systems, financial systems, reward systems, towards something that really leaves options to shape the future, to create opportunities for them to thrive, and to do that in a way where we start to think about problem anticipation and heading off problems before they actually haunt us. Because right now we are in a reactionary mode, and it was already mentioned that reacting is much easier than making a choice, especially because a lot of people think that if you make a choice that's different from the ones that we are making right now, there is automatically sacrifice connected to it. And I think we have to get the message across that if we are not making different choices that might actually lead to a better world, then we might actually move to the ultimate sacrifice, which is that we will lose control over how the future will look. The planet will self-regulate, and we will just be, swept along without really having a lot of opportunities to say, this is what we envision. This is where we want to go. And here is how we think we might get there.
Yeah, that notion of the possibility space connects two really important dimensions of our relationship with the future. Agency, on the one hand, this idea that you will get to choose, but also responsibility, that your decisions are already impacting that possibility space. And so you have a responsibility to reflect on your choices and try to make the right ones. Malka, what do you think about this?
Yes, I mean, I agree. We have a problem with the way our value systems, as everyone says. And of course, you know, as a sociologist, I have a sociological scalpel in my hand, so I'm going to look at these problems in a certain perspective. But, you know, from my work studying disasters and particularly studying disaster risk reduction, we see very clearly that we have a cognitive bias against working on things that can reduce possible ills, even when the possible ill is pretty certain, because everyone knows that hurricanes are going to hit New Orleans. Everyone knows that there are going to be earthquakes along the west coast of the United States. And yet we're still reluctant to invest in these things, because if they don't happen, we're not going to get any credit for it. And even if they do happen, we probably won't get credit for it, because you don't get credit for stuff that didn't happen, right? That mitigates something to the extent where the disaster wasn't a problem. So we have problems with our cognitive biases. We have problems with our incentive systems. And I think also, you know, looking at the value system more broadly, I'm reminded of in Japan after the Fukushima disaster, when there were discussions about restarting the nuclear plants, which have now largely restarted. And there were protests against this. And one of the politicians said that these protests were being led by women who were thinking with their wombs. So, I mean, there's a lot to unpack in there, but let's think about the fact that this man said that people shouldn't be thinking about future humans as they're deciding what to, you know, as they're making this decision, that it's a weakness somehow to be thinking about your children going forward in a decision that has super long-term implications, because, you know, even without an accident, we still don't know how to deal with nuclear waste. So we frame so much of our decisions about the economy, about our decisions about the environment, our decisions about geopolitics, in terms of this sort of, we must be hard-nosed, we must be rational, we must talk in terms of the quantifiable. And that's a real weakness for us right now. That is a critical weakness in terms of how we are approaching the future.
So this really cues up the next thing I want to talk about, which is this idea of failures of imagination. That one of the problems we confront here is our inability somehow to effectively imagine these potential negative consequences, even though we know very well, right? It's not a surprise. There will be more hurricanes, there will be more wildfires, there will be flooding, but somehow that distant harm doesn't impact our day-to-day decision-making now. So Peter, I'll come back to you, give you one more chance to jump in. Why is it so hard to imagine systemic change and to confront the climate crisis?
I think people actually, in my view, pay attention to things even in the future if you trigger them with some, scenarios expressed, let's say, in pictures of how the world might look. A world without ice, a world without polar bears. You see these iconic pictures of the polar bears, sitting on a lonely ice floe going along. I think that triggers emotion, but it doesn't last, because they don't feel the effect directly. And I think that is the problem. We are constantly battling between effective and rational decision making, where we are constantly pinged on, with immediate decisions that we have to make in our daily life, and a lot of them are urgent. And that makes it apparently that wins often out over this long-term decision making that often has to rely on some somewhat more abstract facts and features that we can take in and react to momentarily or for a certain period of time, but then we are distracted again by the by the immediate concerns. And I think that is where we really are struggling to figure out how to address that and how to get into people's mind that things will really play out the way we project. Because for many things we have pretty good pictures since decades. We have projections, and now we see them play out. I mean, we should not be surprised about wildfires. We should not be surprised about fire infernos like we saw in Australia. We should not be surprised in Arizona that the fires are encroaching, Phoenix. We should not be surprised about the fires in Alaska and in California, because if we look at the projection and the dryness, I mean, this year, for example, we had about 5 to 25% of the normal precipitation in wide areas where we had wildfires. So what my hope is that these recurring events that are coming more frequently in more types at more locations and hit people more immediately will actually help to make that connection and will trigger more immediate action, even to long-term things. And one final comment on that, maybe even hard as it is, and horrible as it is to have the COVID-19 shock, the coronavirus shock, it might actually also help to imagine that we don't have that kind of smooth sailing, that things can come out of the blue, and not only that, but things that we know will come actually will occur, even if we don't know exactly when and at which strength. So that shock of the coronavirus, some people say it's a test run for the climate case, because if we are getting into a high amplitude on climate, it might be an extended period of suffering that we see now in the COVID-19 crisis.
Ed, if you will allow me, I think there's a question from one of our audience members that plays exactly into what you were just saying, Peter. I'll read the question out. This is from Alex Mann on Zoom. And his question is, many philosophers have suggested that our orientation to stopping global warming or losing control or saving the planet creates problems for how we think about the multiplicity of issues we are facing. They suggest we should instead accept that the catastrophe has already occurred and act from this place. What would our panelists say about this? Has the catastrophe occurred already? And do our strategies of governance understand the present crisis we're facing?
So I would say, we are moving into the catastrophe. We are seeing the onset. The signs are becoming significant, but no, we have not yet seen the full catastrophe. I think we are seeing crises developing we are going from pressure onto the planet. Planet shows response in terms of crisis. I think we are moving towards a catastrophe, and we are by far not at the point that we can get if we are not taking immediate action. And we know how these scenarios play out. So I think we are still not yet at a point where we can say, we have the full expression, and now we can actually orient ourselves on that and react into the future.
Malka, what do you think? You know catastrophe professionally. So is that a useful frame, and is it an accurate frame? What do you think of the commenter's question?
I do think that theoretically it's useful, but I think that we see this very dramatically playing out with the COVID crisis, is that if we say the catastrophe has happened, people are going to say, well, it's not so bad. It's not happening to me. And without feeling it, without seeing it directly, I think that's gonna be really problematic. But I understand the impulse and the idea behind it, and I think there's some merit to it, because certainly we have, even if the impacts aren't hitting us yet, what we've done, the causation is already well underway into the catastrophe, and there are lots of people who have already suffered the catastrophe. But the people that we need to convince to stop doing what they're doing and to make significant changes are people who are very well insulated from the catastrophe. And that's the real issue.
Dan, do you want to weigh in?
Sure. Well, I'm agreeing with what's been said. And I would say that these people who think they're insulated from the catastrophe are not imagining the full impacts, that nobody can escape. It doesn't matter if you have a fortress mansion or bodyguards, that if you don't have food, then all that becomes irrelevant. If your endocrine system is disrupted so intensely you can't reproduce, then it doesn't matter how much money you have. So we are in a global situation that can't be escaped. And that would be great to bring home to everybody, particularly those who have the delusion of escape still in mind. But that brings up something about cognitive biases. There's a great wheel of cognitive errors online somewhere, probably can be found through Wikipedia, where about 100 common human errors in cognition have been identified and put in family groups. And even that wheel itself is a kind of cognitive illusion that we understand ourselves. It's funny because it's self-reflective, but one of the main ones is you never think it's going to happen to you. So this is how people can have this delusion of escape. And as Peter pointed out, it's how the COVID thing might help us to imagine how bad climate change could be, because nobody can escape the requirement of wearing a mask, and nobody's life has not been changed by this COVID event. And that's a good precursor, because it's actually been relatively low scale and mild in its impacts on prosperous people, and yet you can't buy your way out of it. So the mental setting might be there for many more people, enough to get a political working majority, which is really what we're talking about here. You're not going to ever convince everybody. People like to be contrary, for one thing. But a working political majority could get things done across the planet. And the thing is rapid decarbonization. And we all live in a fossil fuel economy that, in order to do ordinary life, everybody's burning carbon at a rate that's higher than is sustainable over the long haul. So rapid decarbonization has to be instituted, and like faster than ordinary technological improvements would indicate. So we need to do it in 10 years instead of 50 years. Well, this isn't something that capitalism is set up to do. It really is going to take governance and thinking about political economy and going into a kind of Keynesian moment where governments say the economy is going to do this for the survival of society. And the free market won't hack it, because the highest rate of return is not interested in decarbonization or in saving the planet or in dodging the mass extinction event. It's a monomania, the highest rate of return, but things have been mispriced. So it indicates the absolute necessity for coordinated governments, and this is where I think the Paris Agreement is important, coordinated government attempts and strong efforts to direct the original creation of money in the first place. And I'm talking about fiat money, like the dollar, like all of the governmental approved and backed monies, to be created in the first place for decarbonization. And so that would still be legal. It wouldn't be a grotesque change in how we run things. It would just be targeting our initial efforts, the first spend of newly created money in a quantitative easing way towards rapid decarbonization, with no regard for the old definitions of profit. And that would be a practical step forward that maybe everybody's ready to take now. I would hope so.
Yeah, this is one of the things that fascinates me about the global financial markets and high finance. It became really obvious to a lot of people, I think, after the 2008 recession, is how much of it really is imaginary to begin with. You know, that there's all of this elaborate imagination work that goes on to create something like, what were they called? Collateral derivatives, CDLs or something. Is just one example, right? But there are many, many of these elaborate narratives that we make real by believing into, by literally buying into them. And it is possible to tell a different story, to create a different imaginary around value and what we're going to value and how we're going to share and trade and exchange that value. So I think I'm going to pose this question as a forking path, and you can choose one or the other. How do you do that in terms of political economy, or if you prefer, how do you do that as a storyteller? How do you start to tell a different story about this imaginary? Malka, what do you think?
I mean, those are very different questions. As a storyteller, I kind of like to leap ahead to where it's done. And that's not because the getting there is unimportant, but it's because I do think that this piece of the imagination is something that we're really, really missing now. And so whether you're leaping forward and you're imagining, a dystopian, apocalyptic, a warning scenario, whether you're leaping forward and you're imagining something much better, or something that's more nuanced in the middle, as long as you can draw a really clear picture of what life can look like lived differently. And that is just something that's really fundamental and important now, because that's, as the co-panelists have said, that's what we're missing. We're missing people believing that the way we live now can change, and that it's going to change, in fact, whether we like it or not. And it's going to change in a way we really won't like unless we change it ourselves. So as a storyteller, for me personally, I like to show the result without worrying too much about how we get there. I think there are a lot of different paths we could take. We need to take them urgently. We need to take them radically at this point. But rather than prescribing that, I like to show people at least some idea of what it could be. In political science, well, we need, we've talked about a ground up movement. We've talked about a coalition. Honestly, we need to really make some changes in the balance of power with large corporations, because we see that that's where a lot of the problem is in terms of actions, right? And I think there's a real case for doing that, because we see that large multinational corporations have been creeping up on nation state prerogatives for quite some time. They take nation states to court as if they were equal to them. They enforce their own kinds of sovereignty, and they pick and choose among tax structures. And you would think that nation states would be kind of annoyed with this, instead of saying, oh no, let's give you another tax break so you can come and make some jobs for us. So there's one possibility is to sort of look in that direction. I think as we talked about, there's also some more radical changes that could happen in terms of looking at some kind of global, it's hard because let alone the League of Nations, the UN itself does not have really a great either reputation or track record in terms of pulling things together in a disinterested way. But we are, I think, learning more and more about how to run supranational organizations and institutions, from the EU to various other multinational sort of conglomerations that are happening around the world. We're learning more and more about what the benefits of that can be. So there's some possibility there. I think the other thing to look at is the opposite direction, which is going local. We're seeing a lot of local leadership on this issue. And when local means the city of New York, the city of London, that's a large number of people. And when you get, and we're seeing, things like organizations of mayors that are working together to institute changes before the nation states get around to it. So there's some possibility there as well.
Stan, how about you? What do you think? How do we start to try to affect some of these changes in political economy, and maybe how do you approach that as a storyteller? Because I will repeat that the New Yorker has called you maybe the most important political writer of our time, which is a pretty interesting applaud for a science fiction writer.
Yeah, well, I'll do it in the reverse order of Malka and try to talk about the changes and then discuss the storytelling. I like this term that Malka has introduced into the discourse, or maybe invented, infomocracy, because we talk a lot about democracy, and in Western countries or in the Western democracies assume that this is some kind of highest state of humanity or a norm to be aspired to. It's not true in China. And yet China is one of the major civilizations on the planet and crucial to any solution, and also 1 out of every 7 person. One of the questions, to reframe it, you might ask about political representation. Do you believe you have good political representation? So in the United States, we feel that corporations can buy the politicians, whether we elect them or not, and they can heavily influence the process by way of money. Our political representation is damaged. In the European Union, you elect your nation state politicians, but then there's the European Union government itself as a supranational organization that, and so people in Europe feel their political representation is compromised. Polls show that Chinese citizens rate their sense of their own political representation as very high compared to other places. It doesn't look like that from the outside, but we're not speaking the language. We're not looking at the neighborhood councils, the city meetings, the kind of bottom-up Chinese governments. And yet, from our perspective, I think it could still be said that their political representation of any individual is compromised also. Nobody's got good political representation right now, and yet everybody's got some, and everybody does what they can with the system that they're in. So it's a nation state system, and that's the crux. But there's also international trade and economic agreements that have organized the whole thing into one big neoliberal capitalist system. So that's incredibly powerful also, maybe more powerful than any individual nation state. And then there's also the bottom up, as Malka said, the towns, the neighborhoods, the cities, the smaller political units underneath the nation states that are going to just do things because they're a little more flexible. And the people working in those systems feel like, okay, I've got poor political representation at the level of the nation state, but I can go down to my town council and grab somebody by the collar and do something also, join a committee, do something active, and be a citizen beyond just voting. And that's political representation and even political action at the local level. So you can't dismiss or even prioritize any of these 3 levels. They all have to work at once to decarbonize fast enough. Now, okay, then how do you tell that story as a storyteller? Well, first you shoot yourself, it's impossible. The novel, for instance, is not made to do it. And then you think, but wait, the novel can do anything. It's called the novel because it's new. It doesn't have genre rules like other things. You can throw in extraneous stuff. You can have fun. You can pretend. You can put in a heteroglossia of different voices, a polyphony of lots of voices all crowded into one package of storytelling. The novel is capacious. So at that point, you have to throw caution to the winds. You have to throw the ordinary novel of a protagonist and an antagonist and 50 dramatized scenes in a row. You have to maybe throw that overboard for a while and get bold with structure to, if storytelling itself is going to be adequate to this global situation that is beyond any one individual's comprehension, then you have to just throw caution to the winds and try to make up new forms and tell stories that actually reflect this dynamic moment that we're in.
Yeah, and I think storytelling, novels, new narrative structures can model the kinds of relationships we need to have, right? The new awareness of collective action and the ways in which all of our stories are intertwined with one another. So we have to practice. We have to practice living and thinking and feeling in some new ways in order to survive the 21st century. Alexandra, do we have some more questions? I see some piling up.
Yes, we do. And we've had lots of questions, and I think our panelists have done a great job of addressing them in terms of tensions around global sheriff and between local and global concerns. what can we expect in the future in countries and populations where organizations like the UN is already viewed with skepticism and fear? And I think you've addressed that, Malka, so thank you. There's questions around what kind of international governance changes do we think or can we expect to occur in the next generation? Do we think there will be, and I think we've addressed this as well, global divides into climate factions, such as some centered around China and others denying climate change really existing, etc. And let me bring it back to storytelling. Do we think there is a storytelling challenge in terms of bridging a knowledge gap in the challenge of really tackling or making people understand the consequences of their own actions in the context of complex systems? Do we have a challenge there in terms of a knowledge gap?
Malka, do you want to take that one on?
Sure, I think we really do. And I think it has to do with the kinds of stories that we tend to tell, particularly in, let's say, on the North American continent. Because we tend to tell stories about heroes that work by themselves. And we tend to tell stories about heroes whose actions have very few consequences. I mean, I personally, for example, to take gun violence, I don't really think that violent movies contribute that much to gun violence as compared to, you know, the availability of guns. But I do think that violent movies contribute a lot to when people buy guns right after a shooting. Because violent movies tell you that you can use a gun to defend yourselves effectively with zero training and very little risk, because that's what happens to the heroes. They dodge bullets and then they shoot people accurately. And that's, you know, that is kind of a metaphor for the way that particularly Hollywood movies, but a lot of our stories more broadly, tell us we can go along through life, that it's all centered on this main character, that the other characters are, you know, there for the hero's journey and the hero's character development. And that's a big issue that we need to deal with in the kinds of stories that we tell. We need to be thinking about the way people change things as groups and as organizations. And we need to be thinking about people working together, and we need to be thinking about relationships of all kinds and the way people impact each other with their choices.
Science fiction is interesting in this regard because it is quite often an explicitly didactic genre. You know, there's the notion of the info dump or the technical explanation for how this future works. And I'm not one to police the borders of science fiction, but I think one of the things that tends to distinguish the genre is that you're actually going to explain how it works rather than just posit that it exists and not worry too much about it. And you know, that's not a hard and fast rule, but that is something. And as I'm reading your newest novel, Stan, this is a familiar trope from your work, that you take pains. You're deeply invested in the science. You're interested in the technical explanations, and not just by technical. I don't just mean how would you pump ice? How would you pump water from underneath an Antarctic glacier to the top in order to slow down the rate at which that glacier slides towards the ocean? But also social technicalities and political economy, as we were just talking about. So what do you think about this question, Stan, of what are the knowledge gaps that we should be trying to address through storytelling?
Well, following what Malka said, the standard story is easier because it focuses on an individual, the hero, and a plot is when something goes wrong in ordinary life. That's how a plot begins. This is why detective novels are so nicely structured. You start with the problem, and then as you solve the mystery, you unpack the society in which that particular crime or thing going wrong happened because of social reasons. And the detective is a kind of sociologist using sociology to solve a particular issue where something went wrong in the workings of that ordinary society. I like that structure a lot, but it isn't always good at representing how the world works in a larger sense. So that I've thought there are great stories to be told about science. And sometimes there's even interesting stories to be told about things going right or problems being solved and with solutions that seem potentially valuable to think about. So, I mean, I've written a trilogy set in Washington, D.C. about the National Science Foundation bureaucrats and technocrats. There's an interesting crossed personality, the scientist working in government to establish and promote policy. Well, these people don't get written about much, but their stories therefore will be new and interesting. They are individuals, but they're working inside systems. And I want to point out that our fascination with artificial intelligence, and I mean strong artificial intelligence, turning into an agent, you might say, in world history, well, that's not going to happen from computers, but it's already happened in science. Science itself is the general intellect, is a strong artificial intelligence. It's made up of individuals who are all contributing to a group process, and that group process knows more than any one of us. You could not know what the scientific community of this world has learned in the last, well, let's just say the last 100 years. That body of knowledge, no one individual could have come up with in their genius Hollywood heroic self. It's a undercurrent to history, a grinding work. If you try to tell those stories, what you do is you come to certain crux points where if you go in one direction, the situation could evolve. If you go in the other direction, things might be saved or even improved. And you tell the story of that crux moment, and there you have your story. But it's the story of a big system, and it's each story is representational. The characters are types. They stand for their entire group of people that are like them doing similar work. They're not uniquely heroic or great, but they are representative, and they are interesting if you can make them interesting. So this is how I've rolled the dice. This is how I've tried to tell stories, seeing if that will work.
I have two more questions, if that's okay, Ed.
Yeah.
The first one is for you, Stan, and I'll read it out. When I described ministry with its many digressions to a well-read friend of mine, she immediately thought of Moby Dick. Was that an influence? Is Moby Dick a past work? Are there other past works, in your view, that we should revisit as we try to reimagine our future? So that's one question that we'd love to hear an answer to, and you can set homework for the audience in terms of what we should be reading in the next few weeks. And the second question is the culture of business and finance that drives our experience of stories and how those stories are created and disseminated is deeply problematic. What are the media reform opportunities that could radically change this in a way that empowers communities and responsible producers and takes away power from vested commercial interests that monetize violent and conflict-oriented narratives?
Well, let me go to the first question first, because in many ways it's easier and funnier. It's dangerous to reference Moby Dick for a couple of reasons. First, it's one of the greatest novels in American literature, sometimes called the Great American Novel. And when you reference it, especially in connection with your own work, it can sound outrageously pretentious. Secondly, a lot of people hate Moby Dick because they were made to read it in high school, and they hate it with a passion for its very digressory nature that is precisely what this questioner kindly brought up. So I usually, unless I'm asked specifically about it, I certainly would never bring it up myself, but I'm glad it has been brought up because I love that book. Because every one of those digressions, those info dumps, which is a term I hate with a passion, is a prose poem of that's all right. Everybody else uses it too, but this workshop terminology is extremely condescending and wrong. Nevertheless, the chapters in Melville that are about how whales work or how you boil blubber, etc., are all prose poems of great beauty and with a philosophical point to them. They are in effect short stories. So you can write down the plot of Moby Dick on the back of an envelope, and yet it's whatever, 400 pages long. It's quite long. And yet if you give up on the hero plot, if you give up on that notion of what a novel has to be and open up your mind to a larger sense of story, then it indeed takes its place as one of the most beautiful works of art in the Western canon for sure. Now, I take great encouragement. I'm an English major, and American and English literature means a lot to me. The canon is filled with beautiful stuff, beautiful work, and I'm still excavating backwards, and I'll never end that process because there's more good stuff to read than there's time to read. And when I was doing the ministry, I took great hope from the notion that there is no set of rules that binds what a novelist gets to do. So yeah, Moby Dick, check it out. The chapter, there's one particularly beautiful chapter called The Line, where he describes the line that is on the end of the harpoon. The harpoon's going to go into the whale, and the line is on posts all around the rowboat that has 18 people in it, so that when the whale jerks it, it doesn't just break in the tub, but actually goes out without breaking. It's a friction problem, etc. So people are rowing, and our line is right next to their head, right next to their body, that is soon going to be jerked off into the water. And so they're, every one of them, in extreme mortal danger at every moment of their row. And then Melville breaks off and says, but why say more? How is that different from the situation that you're in right now, sitting in your chair? How is it any different? And at that point, you have to say, whoa, he wasn't just talking about whaling. And so, yeah, the storytelling possibilities are vast, and sometimes they've been beautifully exampled for us by these earlier works of art. Now, as to how we leverage new types of stories to make actual change in the world, let me pass it over to Malka.
Oh, yeah. Before I go into that, I'll just say that what talking about digressions makes me think always of Victor Hugo. And in Les Miserables, in Notre Dame, there are these incredible long chapters about like French street kid slang and how you build a cathedral, obviously, but you know, just these incredible digressions, and they're wonderful. It's a wonderful approach. Or more recent, I was rereading El amor en los tiempos de cólera, and wow, so beautiful, such beautiful writing that changes the book from, you know, it starts out seeming like it's a story about one thing, and then it becomes a story about something else, and it becomes a story about something else, and it's the story of this entire place and its history. And anyway, I will stop geeking out about literature briefly so that I can tell you how we can get better literature. And it's a really good question because it is a really serious issue. And of course, you know, in the immediate, it boils down to a capitalism problem, right? We have this sort of consolidation of publishers, that we have a situation where, you know, the amount of money that's put into promo and other things like initial printing and placement and cover design and all sorts of things for your book makes a really big difference in how many people will read your book. And you know, we have a situation also with lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of people who want to write books, and it being difficult for the gatekeepers to even manage to find the things they want, let alone the things that they don't know they want. And we also have this really problematic Hollywood model in front of publishers. The Hollywood model being the movies are really expensive to make, so they're a huge risk. So we're not going to take any risks on the actual content and recycle, you know, whether it's the actors or the titles or the stories over and over and over again, because it's a little bit safer, we think, even though that turns out frequently not to be true. And you know, and then you start getting a little bit of that thinking in the publishing as well. So it's a problem. I think that we're starting to see some different approaches to this. You know, we're starting to see different things being done, both with independent publishing and with self-publishing, with things like Patreon, particularly once people get a little bit of a following. But it's not at a place yet where it can compete. We're seeing a lot of pushes for more diversity in publishing, which is really important and I guess is moving, but pretty slowly. We're even seeing some changes potentially coming out of this moment now of people maybe not having to live in a really expensive city in order to start working in publishing if there's more and more working from home. But all of that, you know, it's a problem. I think, you know, I write mostly about other kinds of media and other kinds of stories in my fiction, as in, you know, news. Media, but I will say the same thing. You know, I think that information is a public good, and frankly, art is too. And we need to be supporting these things. That doesn't mean that, you know, all art or all information is government financed or that it's under the control of the government. That's not what it means at all. But it does mean that there's support and subsidizing, like the subsidizing that happens for agriculture or for electricity or for a lot of other things that we use without thinking about the fact that the government is putting money into them. And we really need to think about different models that will allow people to take more risks in these areas where we need to be taking risks, because we need different stories. We need different types of art. We need people to be working on this. And, you know, when you've got a lot of people who are worried not just about the amount of profit they'll make, but whether their publishing house will go under, it's very difficult to take those risks. So I think there's some promising movements, but I think we really need some structural shifts as well.
And I just want to point out that great literature, and I include the work that you have both produced as well, can change your relationship with time. And that's one of the things that we need in order to change our relationship with the future. Alexandra?
Thank you so much, Ed. Thank you to everyone that has joined us in this conversation today. I wish we had another hour left of this conversation. It's been wonderful listening to the three of you today at the beginning. So thank you again to everyone that has tuned in, to our wonderful panelists, our extraordinary moderator, and of course to our event hosts, Future Tense, Arizona State University's Convergence Lab, and our partner Letras Libres. Please join us for our next event on next Wednesday at noon. All the information will be available on our Twitter page at Future Tense Now. Thank you so much.